Australia shuts down its notorious Manus Island detention center, but hundreds of refugees say they have nowhere else to go. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmakers are the asylum seekers on Manus Island. Australia's detention center on Manus Island has long angered human rights groups around the world. They say detainees have been housed in deplorable conditions, and men there have faced systemic abuse and neglect. Evidence backing those allegations is so strong that the Australian government paid out a settlement worth more than $50 million. But only a small group of refugees ever saw that money. Now, the facility has been shut for good after Papua New Guinea ordered its closure on constitutional grounds. But what happens to the hundreds of refugees still living there? With few options left, many asylum seekers are refusing to leave. Natalie Pohonen has more.
October 31st is a historic day for Australia's border protection policy. 16 years ago, it opened the Manus Island Detention Centre in Papua New Guinea. Now, it will be shut down permanently. As part of Australia's border protection measures, asylum seekers arriving by boat have been flown to offshore processing facilities in two other Pacific nations, Papua New Guinea and Nauru. The Australian government's policy is to block any refugees from resettling in Australia if they try to enter by boat. The UN has called Australia's offshore detention program cruel and inhuman, and in contravention of international human rights. But last year, a PNG court ruled that the facility on Manus Island was unconstitutional, and the Australian government has had to close it down. There are about 600 men, asylum seekers from places like Iran, Afghanistan and Sri Lanka who are still inside. Some of these men have spent up to 4 years at the detention centre.
I landed at the Manus Island Detention Centre against my will in September 2013. My happiness and my future has been taken by the Australian government. My life has been destroyed.
This year, a group of Manus Island detainees was awarded a $56 million settlement after launching Australia's largest human rights class action. The men said they had suffered physical and psychological injury from their detention. The Australian government said the money was not an admission of liability. The Manus facility itself was opened in 2001, closed in 2008 and reopened in 2012 when there was a sharp rise in the number of people trying to reach Australia by boat. Stopping those kinds of asylum seekers was a core election promise of the coalition, which went on to win the 2013 election.
And we'll stop the boats with tough, proven policies.
It's a message the country's two major parties have both echoed.
We cannot allow migration to Australia to be carried out by people smugglers.
There is no humanity in a government that puts in place a legislative framework against advice that can and did have the effect of luring vulnerable people to their deaths.
The men who are still on Manus Island have been offered the chance to return to their home countries or a place at the Nauru Detention Centre. Some have been admitted into a US refugee program. Others have been told they can resettle in Papua New Guinea, but many don't feel they'll be safe if they leave the facility. The Australian government says it will find a solution, but right now there are no immediate answers for the men on Manus Island.
Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined from Melbourne by prominent human rights lawyer Julian Burnside, and from Darwin, Brad Vermeer. He is a member of the country Liberal Party, which is part of Australia's ruling coalition. Thanks both so much for joining us. Julian, let me start with you. We're talking about a facility that at its maximum only hosted around 1,300 people. Compare that to the Calais jungle camp, for example, which hosted about 6,000 at one point. So how has the Manus Detention Centre left this big of a scar on Australia's human rights record, and will shutting it down be able to rectify that?
It has left a scar because it is one example of Australia's policy of locking people up indefinitely if they try to seek asylum in Australia. Now, you referred to it as a detention centre. It was a detention centre until the Papua New Guinea Supreme Court said that detaining innocent people indefinitely was unconstitutional, and so it has been an open centre for the last year or so. So in other words, people are free to come and go if they want, but they are not willing to be forced out of it because they're terrified of the locals.
Okay, and do you think, though, closing it down now can help rectify the damage that it's done to Australia's reputation as a developed country that supports human rights?
No, I don't think so, because we're still holding hundreds of people on the Pacific island of Nauru. Manus has been used primarily for unaccompanied men. Nauru has been used primarily for family groups, unaccompanied children and unaccompanied women. And, you know, we have this really brutal policy of locking up human beings who've done nothing worse than ask for protection from persecution. And almost all of them turn out to have valid claims for refugee protection.
Okay, let me just get Brad's response to that. And Brad, tell us as well about how you feel shutting down this detention centre will affect, perhaps, Australia's role now in protecting, or better treating, I should say, asylum seekers in the country.
Look, the coalition government, since coming to office, has had a clear policy when it comes to illegal maritime arrivals. Individuals who wish to enter Australia via people smuggling and by boat will not be settled in this country. The current Manus Island Regional Processing Facility has closed as of today, and this facility, the inhabitants of this facility have known since at least May that this facility was going to be closed. They've had the opportunity to move to, I believe, 3 other facilities, depending on the progress or the status of their application. So Australia and these facilities are offering the same, if not better, standards that the current facility was offering. Australia has, due to previous policy settings of previous governments, had issues with huge numbers of individuals seeking to come to Australia by boat via the people smuggling trade. The policy settings of the current coalition government, which came into office in 2013, have stopped these boats from arriving on Australian shores and have stopped needless deaths at sea. These individuals in these centres, if they are found to be genuine refugees, have the option of being settled in Papua New Guinea or in Nauru. There is also the opportunity now, with the deal struck between the Australian government and the former administration, Barack Obama's administration, that at least 1,250 refugees will be able to be settled in the United States after proper vetting.
Okay, Julian, let me ask you why that's not good enough. Resettling them, first of all, into camps that are, as Brad was saying, equal or even better conditions than Manus, plus the U.S. refugee exchange program. What's wrong with that as an alternative?
Okay, first of all, Brad has just engaged in the sort of dishonest hypocrisy which characterises the government of which he's part. Calling them illegal maritime arrivals is false. They do not commit any offence under Australian law by coming to Australia and asking for protection from persecution. Second, he says that the coalition was very worried about refugees drowning in their attempt to reach safety in Australia. So worried about them drowning that his government will punish them if they don't drown. Now, the fact is that the government has made it very clear that offshore processing was calculated to make coming to Australia to seek protection so undesirable that people will be deterred from their attempt to come. He says with a sense of pride that the boats have stopped coming. In other words, people are no longer coming to Australia seeking protection. That's because we turn them away before they can reach Australian territorial waters. Frankly, I think what he has said shows just how disgraceful Australia's treatment of boat people has been in the last few years, and his government takes great responsibility for that because it's their dishonesty, which enables it to continue to be acceptable, apparently, to the Australian public at large, who don't realise that by calling boat people illegal, you are actually misleading the public about the nature of the people who are seeking protection. Second, I do not think that the fact that the accommodation that they're being forced into in East Lorengau is better accommodation than they had at the processing centre, that doesn't matter a scrap. They are scared of being attacked by the locals. Since the processing centre has been open, a number of the refugees who've lived there have gone to East Lorengau, and they have been attacked in the streets, robbed. They've been attacked with knives and machetes. One person held in the processing centre was killed by a local, actually killed in the camp by a local. And today, just before the camp was closed, the locals raided the security office of Wilson Security, which is supposed to be there to protect the refugees. Their office was raided by the locals, who are now looting the place. Now, you know, it's safety that these people are after. That's why they're seeking protection. They're looking for a place where they can be safe. And they're not safe outside the processing centre.
And on that, Brad, I'd like you to respond, but first, we have spoken actually to a number of detainees in Manus, and one of them, Samad Abdul, said this, which I found quite relevant. He said, "Please, I can survive without food, power, and water, but please save me from Papua New Guinea Defence Forces and locals. Please don't force me to live in the community." That is, of course, because of the attacks that Julian was attesting to there and the abuse that these detainees say they've suffered at the hands of the local community. So, Brad, why is there no security to protect detainees then from local aggression and the alleged abuse then by security forces?
Well, it's simply not true. The security is available at the alternative accommodation that has been provided for individuals who were at the former Manus Regional Processing Centre. The centre currently has no further security because it has been closed, and as of tomorrow will become once again part of a Papua New Guinea naval establishment. The fact remains is that the individuals who are currently in the previous Manus Regional Processing Centre and their advocates were campaigning to have this particular establishment closed. It is closed now, and there are other better facilities available for individuals who are having their applications processed, which provide food, water, accommodations, and security, most importantly. But these offers have not been taken up. They have been on the table for some time. It is also important to note that it isn't the previous Manus Regional Processing Facility was an open centre. I believe there were up to 200 movements per day to the local town of people who were staying in that particular facility. And so as far as security risks are concerned, there was free movement, and there is security available at the new facilities, which these individuals are being asked to move to.
Brad, quickly let me ask you, if you believe Australia has believed appropriately here and has respected the human rights of these detainees, why did they pay out that $56 million settlement for human rights violations and failure to protect the human rights of these detainees?
Look, that was what is an appropriate settlement that was paid, but let's remember what Australia has been trying to do from the very beginning. We were facing many arrivals by boat to our shores, but also individuals who were seeking asylum were being exploited by people smugglers. What the Australian government, what the coalition did when we were in opposition, and now what we're implementing in office, is and we have achieved, we have not had an illegal maritime arrival in Australia for 3.5 years. The intention of this policy is to stop people from making that dangerous journey to Australia. Okay.
Julian, I caught you rolling your eyes at a couple points there, so let me just get your response.
Well, first of all, I think it's interesting that Brad takes pride in the fact that refugees cannot reach Australia. Australia was one of the main contributors to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that every human being has the right to seek asylum in any country they can reach. We have also signed the Refugees Convention, and yet Brad and his government seem to take pride in the fact that refugees can't reach Australia in order to avail themselves of the right to protection, which we acknowledged so proudly in 1948. He also overlooks the fact that if there is security available, it seems to be hopelessly inadequate. Otherwise, how does he explain the knife attacks, the machete attacks, the shooting and killing of refugees who've been in the processing centre? Now, it's been happening. The first death in the processing centre happened in February 2014 when a local who was on the payroll of the Australian government, a local Papua New Guinean, killed a man called Reza Barati, killed him whilst he was being attacked by 12 other guards, most of them PNG locals, all of them on the Australian payroll. Now, you know, it's disgraceful. We know that the people in the processing centre feel grievously unsafe when confronted with PNG locals. I don't know what's hard to understand about that, but the fact is that these people who were taken there by force, against their will, by the Australian government, it is Australia's obligation now to protect them from the very people who are supposedly giving them protection, but in fact are attacking them and in some instances killing them.
Okay. Brad, I'd like to bring it full circle then, and justified or not, whether you think it's justified or not, the treatment of detainees at the Manus Detention Centre has left a massive scar on Australia's human rights records. You know it's received international criticism, not just from human rights groups, but from various governments around the world. What happens now to those detainees so that your government at least can try and rectify or heal that scar?
Well, the detainees who are currently at the previous Manus Regional Processing Centre have the opportunity to move to the 3 other locations that have been made available as an alternative accommodation. If they still remain, the 600 men still remain in that facility, it will become an active military facility, depending on the date that the Papua New Guinea Defence Force reconstitutes that facility. So ultimately, that issue as to what happens with those individuals will be up to the Papua New Guinea Navy. But the Australian government and the Papua New Guinea government have encouraged these individuals to move to the alternative accommodation services that have been made available to these people. And the important thing to remember here is that they have been encouraged by... sorry?
I'm sorry, Brad. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut you off. We are completely out of time, but I'd like to thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers, and Julian Burnside as well. No. Thank you both. Still to come, another U.S. state refuses to do business with firms that boycott Israel. We debate whether it's constitutional. And we speak to Zambia's opposition leader about being arrested and the future of the country's democracy. Opponents of the movement to boycott Israel have yet another ally, the U.S. state of Wisconsin. The governor there signed an order to withhold government contracts from any company that joins the BDS movement. BDS stands for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and is a strategy that aims to pressure the Israeli government to comply with international law. Wisconsin now joins 23 other states that have signed similar legislation into law. So we wanted to know, can states penalize companies for their politics? That debate in a moment. But first, Vanessa Keneally has this report.
Wisconsin has become the latest U.S. state to target the Palestinian-led boycott of Israel, the divestment and sanctions movement known as BDS. On Friday night, Governor Scott Walker banned state agencies from working with businesses that are blacklisting Israel, saying, "We stand firmly against discrimination in any form and we wholly support our friends in Israel." Wisconsin is now the 24th state to pass an executive order or law halting BDS activity. Earlier this month, Maryland implemented a similar ban. And around the same time, Texas caused outrage after it made victims of Hurricane Harvey sign a form saying they wouldn't boycott Israel before receiving aid. These decisions made at a state level are also being supported nationally.
I'm very concerned that we may not be able to defeat this, but we are trying extremely hard to show that this is something that cannot happen. As governor in South Carolina, we were the first state to fight it off. I know how dangerous and abusive this would be, and so we'll continue fighting this the whole way through.
The BDS movement is used to battling bureaucrats since its foundation in 2005 and has strong support internationally.
No law in France forbids people from boycotting in a peaceful way for political reasons. We noticed that concerning Russia, Iran, China, and even Canada, so we don't see why Israel should be the only state exempt.
Israel recognises the threat, allocating $26 million to fight BDS last year, as well as stopping some of its supporters from entering the country in July. And Tel Aviv is being openly supported by Washington. In August, the US threatened to cut funding to the UN over its plans to publish a list of companies involved in Israeli settlement building. But BDS continues to gain support around the world. In India, 16 million members of the All India Kisan Sabha group pledged support to the Palestinian cause in recent weeks. Back in the US, those implementing anti-BDS laws say individuals still have the right to boycott Israel on their own. But civil liberty groups say those regulations are a violation of free speech. Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now to discuss this further from Minneapolis, Minnesota is Jacob Milner. He's a senior policy analyst for the Israel Project, a pro-Israel think tank. And from London, we have Ben White. He's a BDS activist and the author of Israeli Apartheid, A Beginner's Guide. Thanks both so much for joining us. Jacob, let me just start with you. Why does the BDS movement not constitute a legal form of peaceful protest or collective action protected by the U.S. Constitution, as so many boycotts have before in other movements?
Yeah, hi, and thank you for having me on. This is really great, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. What sets the BDS movement from our perspective, aside from other boycott movements, is that BDS is really a form of discrimination. The purpose of the BDS movement, if you ask its founders and supporters, and it's not that hard to find this sort of information, is really not to pressure Israel, but to destroy Israel. And the focus of BDS on the only Jewish state in the world really sends a signal that this is an effort of discrimination, not an effort, human rights campaign.
Okay, Ben, is it a form of discrimination?
Well, I mean, just to pick on two aspects of what Jacob was just saying there. The BDS campaign is very clear about what it's asking for. There are three demands, all grounded in international law and the rights of the Palestinian people. They're based on the rights of the Palestinian refugees to return, the right of equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, which they currently do not have. They face systematic discrimination. And the rights of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip not to be living under a military regime, which they currently do as well. And as for the claim that the BDS movement is singling out Israel, I mean, although this is said ad infinitum by the Israeli government and by Israel advocacy groups like the Israel Project, it's really a preposterous claim. All single-issue campaigns by nature have a single issue at their heart. And I'm not sure whether Jacob and the Israel Project have ever berated pro-Tibet, free Tibet activists for quote-unquote singling out China, or whether they've penned op-eds asking climate change campaigners why they're not writing about the arms trade. BDS is a single-issue campaign, but by trying to delegitimize it, the message is that Palestinians are uniquely undeserving of solidarity.
Jacob, I'll let you respond, and I'd actually like to ask you about another point, but if you want to respond to what Ben just said, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, Ben is missing the larger point here, is that the BDS movement, the focus on Israel, is just a long line of historical tropes against Jews in general. And we've seen recently world leaders such as Macron in France, the Secretary General, talk about how anti-Zionism is really a modern form of anti-Semitism. And the focus, when you have hundreds of territorial disputes in the world, hundreds of human rights violators in the world, and the focus on one country in the Middle East, which is by far and away the most democratic and free and progressive country in the region, really, I think, is a good question to BDS activists.
Ben, quick response. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, again, just to repeat, there are dozens, probably hundreds of active consumer boycott campaigns happening right now in North America, in Europe, all around the world. It's a tried and trusted method of civil disobedience and civil society activism. These boycotts target states, non-states. Again, the BDS campaign singles out Israel because it is Israel that has stripped Palestinians of citizenship, ethnically cleansed Palestinians in the Nakba, continues to rule millions of Palestinians today under a military regime. And actually, Jacob's remark just now highlights a really key point, which is that an underlying assumption of criticism of the Israeli government, of the Israel Project and others, this criticism of the BDS movement, the underlying assumption is that Israel is not actually doing anything objectionable enough to warrant a boycott. Now, given the vast documented evidence that Israel is today, every single day, committing grave violations of international law and human rights, to maintain that position is either delusional or, more troublingly, indicative of a worldview that sees Palestinian lives as worthless.
Okay, I'd like to look, if we can, again at the issue of constitutionality, the question of it, and we heard Senator Gillibrand of New York, in particular, criticize the actual legislation itself. She does support the anti-BDS movement, but she fears the chilling effect that it will actually have on free speech. As an American yourself, Jacob Milner, I'm wondering if you share that fear as well.
Any of these laws, the current congressional legislation moving through the process, the Cardin-Portman bill, which is the Anti-Israel Boycott Act, really is just an extension of the constitutionally upheld 1977 anti-boycott bills. And so, no, to answer your question, I don't have a concern as an American. The bills that have been passed in 24 states now, in about half the states, and bills that are moving through Congress and have been upheld as constitutional in the past, do not punish individuals and do not punish individuals for free speech, and don't punish companies for having an opinion. What they do is simply say that the state doesn't have to subsidize a company that takes a discriminatory position against Israel. I will say this is a unique situation where we've seen in about 2 years half the states in this country pass anti-BDS laws and pass them with huge majorities across the board, from states like California and Rhode Island to Alabama and Arizona, red states and blue states. And I think it's important to understand that the ferocity of the ferocity and the speed of these bills passing is really indicative of the understanding that the BDS movement is a discriminatory movement aimed at the only Jewish state in the world.
Okay, Ben, I realize you're not in the United States, you're not an American, but still, do you feel there's a threat there too? Could the UK perhaps start looking at similar anti-BDS laws and sanctions against companies that engage?
It's important, of course, to note that the American Civil Liberties Union, a giant when it comes to the protection of free speech and civil rights in the US, is active on this particular issue. The ACLU has described all of these state-level initiatives against BDS as being unconstitutional on the basis that political boycotts are protected by the First Amendment. But you're right to point out a wider context. Pro-Palestine solidarity activism and support for BDS has been under attack in the UK and in other countries in Europe too. And actually, there's one thing I think that Jacob was right about when he was referring to a, quote, unique sort of scenario over the last couple of years with respect to this wave of anti-BDS legislation. There is something unique about it in that here we have a state, the state of Israel, which in recent years is very anxious and worried about the growth of the BDS campaign. And it is mobilizing state resources as well as the resources of pro-Israel groups around the world to try and roll back this surge in civil society activism, to try and use various methods and tactics, including lawfare, including the use of the law to try and stifle protected free speech and legitimate political activism. So there is something unique there, and certainly the surge we saw in anti-BDS legislation in the US, as well as initiatives in Europe, come from this anxiety that the Israeli government has, an anxiety born of the fact that there is a deadlock on the ground, an apartheid status quo, and that Palestinians asking for BDS are finding more and more people willing to listen to them around the world.
Ben, let me ask you if you think it's too much of a stretch.
I will say, if I can just respond quickly.
Go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, and I will just say one thing is that, again, the laws in the United States in no way inhibit a person from having any views or engaging in BDS. And moreover, it doesn't even stop a company from engaging in BDS. It just says that the state doesn't have to contract with that company in the same way a state wouldn't contract with groups that are involved with racism or homophobia or sexism or any other of these sort of discriminatory efforts. And one other thing I would point out is that, you know, BDS, the Israeli and Palestinian economies are so intertwined that BDS really does hurt the Palestinians just as much, if not more, than it hurts Israelis. You know, SodaStream is a great example of that, and I'm sure Ben is well aware of what happened with SodaStream, which was a company paying Palestinians more than a livable wage and a good wage in a settlement, and they eventually came under so much pressure that they had to pick up and leave and move across the Green Line. And had to lay off all those workers. So, you know, there are unintended consequences. And when you hear from Palestinians like Abbas talk about why he doesn't support BDS, I think that really sends a strong signal.
Ben, I'm actually interested to get your take on Abbas's stance there that Jacob just alluded to.
Sure. I mean, obviously, in the discussion about the legitimacy of BDS, and in the context of the US and elsewhere, many people have pointed to the historical precedent of the boycott campaign against apartheid South Africa that played an important role in the end of that regime. And therefore, it's amusing and illustrative to see Jacob cite a very similar argument used by people who are against the boycott in South Africa, along the lines of a boycott supposedly hurts the people it's trying to help. Palestinian trade unions, workers' groups, civil society organizations are all backing the BDS campaign. And the number one enemy, as it were, of the Palestinian economy and of Palestinian workforce is the Israeli military occupation. I mean, that's an obvious position stated by the likes of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and so on. An economy can't thrive under a colonial occupation that denies the indigenous population access to natural resources and so forth. So with respect to the impact of BDS on the Palestinians, it's Palestinians who have actually called for BDS, and it's we outside who are responding to it.
Okay, Ben, let me ask you this. I've heard some Israelis kind of scoff at the concept of BDS because they think it's so trivial. It hasn't worked. They say that, you know, their businesses have really felt very little effect. But when you see state legislators feel they have to act at this level, sanctioning companies who subscribe to BDS, does it tell you that BDS is actually working?
Well, the BDS campaign has seen numerous specific successes. For the example of the French multinational Veolia, the British company G4S, there's been numerous examples where specific campaigns have seen particular demands met or on the process to being met with respect to ending the complicity of various entities and corporations with violations of international law being perpetrated as part of the Israeli occupation. In terms of the bigger picture, and of course BDS also involves cultural boycott, academic boycott, of which again there's been growth in all of these sectors, as well as support for BDS on campuses and so on. And in fact, one might also point out a large amount of support for BDS among faith communities. And one of the largest, most active groups supporting BDS in the US is Jewish Voice for Peace. But in terms of the big picture, there's one point that I find pro-Israel advocates often understand quite well, actually, although often they have a misunderstanding of BDS. But on one point, I think they often hit the mark, which is that one of the key roles of BDS, apart from educating people about the realities of Israeli apartheid and being an expression of solidarity with the Palestinian people's struggle, a key part of it is changing the discourse and the language and the approach to Israel, because in fact Israel is singled out by the US government, by the British government, by the EU and others, and Israel is singled out by these parties for impunity. And BDS is changing the language on that. BDS changes the conversation to one of accountability, where so far impunity for violations has existed.
Okay, Jacob, let me ask you this. The United States threatened to cut funding for the United Nations because it was going to publish a list of companies involved in Israeli settlement building. Those settlements are illegal, according to the United Nations, according to international law. So why should those companies be protected while companies that subscribe to BDS should not?
You know, I think any discussion of settlements or possibility of a two-state solution really should be left up to the Israelis and the Palestinians, the people on the ground. I don't think injecting outside sources is a productive exercise there. But if I can get back to one thing that Ben said briefly, first of all, you know, BDS is certainly a threat, but I will say that the Israeli economy over the past few years has been doing exceptionally well. You know, Israeli companies are world leaders in numerous areas, in high tech and innovation, in all of that, in cybersecurity. So I think it's important to understand that while, you know, BDS advocates try to isolate Israel, we see more investment in Israel. We see more foreign cooperation with Israel around the world. Every day it seems that there's foreign leaders in Israel to work in cooperative efforts with the Israeli government and with Israeli companies. So I think that's one important thing to understand. And what states are saying isn't that we see such a huge threat from BDS coming, so we have to create these laws. What they're saying is that BDS is discrimination, and the state is not going to fund or help subsidize discrimination. President Obama said it best, saying that, you know, people are free to their own views, but the state doesn't have to the country and the states don't have to subsidize them. And I think that's an important thing to understand, is that from our point of view, BDS is discriminatory, and discrimination should not be subsidized.
Okay. Ben, let me wrap it up with you then. Where does this legislation actually leave the BDS movement?
Well, I mean, in the US, you've got a lot of amazing groups. I mentioned Jewish Voice for Peace. There's also, of course, the US campaign. You've got groups that specifically exist to help and support Palestine activists like Palestine Legal in the face of these types of attacks. But actually, it's often the sort of throwaway marks that are the most instructive. And something that Jacob said at the beginning of his last remarks is worth dwelling on. He said, and this, of course, is a line that's very typical of pro-Israel advocacy groups, that the two parties on the ground should be left to sort of sort it out amongst themselves. Well, of course, in a situation where you have an occupier and occupied, a colonizer and colonized, a situation characterized by settler colonial power structures and a massive asymmetry of resources, then of course, if you just quote unquote leave the two sides to get on with it, then that's a recipe for a permanent status quo that's characterized by occupation, colonialism, and apartheid. And these legislative initiatives that are designed to restrict and intimidate the activities of BDS campaigners in the US and in other countries are ultimately doomed to fail, in that the main reason, the main trigger for the BDS movement, i.e. Israeli policies, are continuing. So with that respect, it's only likely that the BDS movement will continue to grow.
Okay, Ben White, I will have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this debate, but I'd like to thank you both, Jacob Milner as well, so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
We believe in democracy, and as for me, myself, I don't think there's democracy anymore. I'm a youth, and I've got the right to choose which party to support, but it's like we are not allowed to.
Zambian President Edgar Lungu won last year's election by a narrow margin, an election that opposition leader Hakainde Hichilema called a sham. Now, tensions between the two rivals continued to rise and resulted in Hichilema's arrest. He was charged with treason for obstructing the president's motorcade. Unrest followed Hichilema's detention, and a state of emergency was declared. Since then, members of the opposition have accused the ruling party of using emergency powers to silence dissent. Well, the state of emergency has ended, and Hakainde Hichilema is out of jail. He now joins me from London to talk about Zambia and his future in the country. Thanks so much for being with us. Let's just make clear, you're not in exile. You were not put on trial for treason. And according to reports, you were released via a deal negotiated with the Commonwealth that was in the public interest. What does that mean exactly?
Well, thank you very much for hosting me. In the first place, I want to confirm that I'm not in exile. I would never be in exile. I would never go in exile at all. That's against my DNA. I'm out of prison because I did not commit a crime at all. I was detained on trumped-up charges. It's very clear to everybody to see. So I'm out, and we continue to seek that which is right for democracy in our country, which will basically support the prevalence of peace and stability and allow us a platform that will offer economic and social alternatives to basically benefit the people of Zambia. So I'm not in exile. I'm out. I'm happy that I'm out. Yes, the Commonwealth got involved because it was essential that as I left jail, we put in place a situation or a process that will allow to bring, if you like, the country back to normalcy, because there's a lot of disorder in our country and substantial abuses are taking place in our country.
So politically, what is your role now? Will you continue as opposition leader? And as such, do you fear you could be arrested again?
No. We're not afraid of being arrested again. In the first place, we were arrested on trumped-up charges. Those charges were never going to stand. And that's common knowledge now. So we continue basically representing the people, talking for the people on many issues, especially those issues that have caused a lot of problems with regard to the democratic situation in our country. Democracy in our country today is challenged by many things. One, we have a breakdown in the rule of law, a serious breakdown in the rule of law. Number two, we have abuse of fundamental human rights, liberties, and freedoms. Number three, we have a criminal justice system that treats citizens guilty until proven innocent, when we should have a system that treats citizens as innocent until proven guilty. We also have a flawed electoral process that lacks transparency, and it's important for the country and for Africa at large to ensure that Zambia retains or brings about a truly independent electoral commission that will deliver, transparent, credible elections. And we also have a situation in our country where literally, we have governance that has broken down. Top on the agenda of the governance subject is the cancerous levels of corruption that have evolved in the procurement processes, roads, fertilizer, loan procurement, as well as basic other procurement arrangements that really have allowed a situation where a few people are pocketing a substantial amount of money, abusing the public office entrusted in them by the people of Zambia, at the expense of no medicines in hospitals and education. Students are not in school because they don't have funds to stay in school.
Okay, understood. But I mean, you've run for president 5 times. You've lost 5 times.
Yeah.
I understand your ambitions remain the same and you feel those elections were not carried out free and fairly. But is there a chance that Zambians don't feel your opposition party is strong enough to assume the presidency?
I mean, the figures speak for themselves. We argue that we won the last elections. And when we were unhappy about the last elections, we decided to pursue a peaceful and civilized process. And that's a process where we drew out a presidential petition, which petition has not been heard and which is against the constitutional provisions. And in the process, you have the constitutional breakdown in the sense that the executive has failed to respect the constitutional provisions, including the fact that the presidency should have shifted to the Speaker of the National Assembly to allow for a fair adjudication of the petition, as well as to circumvent the obvious, if you like, immunity clauses that are contained in the Constitution. That did not happen. So the fact that our petition has not been heard up to date really creates a situation where it may be incorrect to say we lost the last election until our petition is heard.
Okay, but in the meantime, Zambia really is. It's a stable, it's a peaceful country, in spite of having more than 70 tribes. And since 1991, you've actually had 5 presidents after Kenneth Kaunda ruled for some 26 years. That's a relatively good record for what is a young democracy.
that is a record we want to protect. That's a record we do not want to be changed by a set of leaders that are in office today. We want to protect that record by ensuring that we're peace and stability. But this peace and stability can only be anchored on basically respect for the human rights, liberties, and freedoms. Can be only assured by respecting the rule of law and ensuring that we do not have the political violence that we experience in today's Zambia. This is unprecedented. We want to return the country back into normalcy so that this record can be maintained, can be respected, and passed on to the future generations.
Now, all of the instability that you've described, whether it's perceived or otherwise, it leaves Zambia's economy in a rather precarious position. How much longer can the economy and ordinary Zambians actually go on like this? Investors are starting to pull out. There are concerns about the stability of the economy. How long can that go on for?
Well, that's exactly the question we want to answer, to get a leadership to manage public affairs in a manner that will create an attractive and stable investment climate, so that we can, see more investments coming in our country, and we can therefore create jobs in an environment of joblessness. We can also create business opportunities for that may not be employable. And essentially, this is the reason that we're seeking public office, to make sure that we can bring stability, predictability in our country. And if we don't grow the economy, it means we can't deal with the question of poverty. We can't deal with the question of support to those that are underprivileged in our society. This is the very reason that these processes, democratic institutions, must be respected and must be credible, must not be abused by the few for their personal gain through corruption. Absolutely.
Okay, particularly though in your geographical context, in the African context, do you feel like you and so many other opposition parties and countries surrounding you have been left alone to fight a battle to keep their democracies stronger?
I think the question we have now, not for Zambians alone, not for Africans alone, but the worldwide, is really, if we believe, the good population of the world believes in freedoms and rights and liberties, and believes in order via the rule of law, believes in constitutionalism, believe in, if you like, transparency. We, all of us who believe in those things, irrespective of the country boundaries, must band together and voice our concerns, voice our, if you like, views when there's an affront or confrontation arising from the state machinery on these basic rights and these basic norms that allow for, if you like, entrepreneurship to thrive, and therefore investment and job creation and poverty reduction. Very important. At the moment, we've seen a situation where, because there appears to be everybody busy doing their own things, looking after their own turf, the international obligations for which the UN, the United Nations, was established, are being ignored. And that's not good for democracy.
Okay.
If we don't do anything in this direction, we will allow basically oppressive regimes to grow in number. And that's not good for anybody around the world.
Okay, quick final question then. What will we see from Zambia's opposition, led by you, in the coming months?
You will see a continued drive on the need for the respect to restore the rule of law, need to respect, to restore human rights, the need for us to remove violence out of our politics, especially militarization of our politics has no place in our country. As a country with a history of hosting refugees, we want to see an end to a situation that is obtaining now, where we're exporting refugees and political prisoners are now occupying a lot of space which they shouldn't occupy in our prisons and in our police cells. You see us fighting for a reintroduction of, if you like, transparency, the zero tolerance on corruption, and also you will see us pushing for enacting laws, including that to bring about a truly independent electoral commission to deliver free, fair, credible elections. Further, you will see us beginning to drive issues that concern, if you like, reform of the criminal justice system, so that we return the country to a situation where it is normal to perceive every citizen innocent until proven guilty, not what is obtaining now. That still certain sectors of the citizens are guilty until proven innocent. That is not, that's not correct, that's not a norm. So we will push all these areas. And I think it's not us to push alone. Everybody who loves peace and stability as a platform for development, social and economic, must be part of this process.
Okay, Hakainde Hichilema, thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
И попало в голову, я сколько мог проехал, еще машина тоже, когда двигатель попали, что остановилась.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Check out more of our stories and debates on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, the leader of the Kurdish regional government steps down. What will Masoud Barzani's departure mean for the region? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.